Start the recording and welcome, Carol. Carol, thank you for being such a loyal attendee of our Tea Talks in person. Hope you're having a good afternoon today. And I'll watch the door as more people enter. But today is July 17th. It is the third Thursday of the month, as it always is when we do our Tea Talks. And we have a special guest this month, Carla Fernandez, who I'm going to just briefly give an intro to, and then we're going to jump right in. And Carla's going to take us into a deep topic, one of our favorite topics as death workers and grievers and lovers, renegade grief, how to grieve out loud and unabashedly and in different mediums, and it'll be a great conversation. And I was reading up on Carla's work right before we started, and yeah, it's so aligned. So I'm grateful to listen to and grateful for your time here today. All right, so just to summarize who we have here with us today, humans have known grief for as long as we've known love. Grief from a significant death is one of the deepest rites of passage we'll experience. Yet we live in a culture that encourages us to sweep our grief under the rug and get back to the status quo as quickly as possible. Why does taking the time and space to tend to grief feel countercultural in mainstream America, which is such a big conversation? And in her book, Renegade Grief, A Guide to the Wild Ride of Life After Loss, Carla Fernandez, co-founder of the nonprofit The Dinner Party, invites readers to push back against our death-denying culture and really get to know grief by exploring the myriad ways it can enliven us and help us to grow, connect, and heal. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, that's how you know somebody's walked through this, whole fire, because we're not bypassing it. Like the grief work and the trench that we're in along the way and the ways that we move through it are very real. But you get to this place at the end where you're like, I gotta hold love in order to survive all of the rest of this, right? And I love arriving at that place. And then I'll just add that you became passionate about connecting people through their grief after experiencing acute loneliness in the weeks and months after her father's death, a time when the outpouring of support and phone calls ended and society expected her to move on. Drawing on her instincts as a community organizer, Carla turned to the place she missed her dad the most, the dinner table. I was so moved by that. She opened up her own table to a small group of other people who had recently lost someone so that they could dig into their shared life experience. Over the next decade, the small group would grow into a nationwide community known as the Dinner Party. So what real grief work you are doing. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you, Erin. I'm so excited to be here with you. For everyone who's here presently and listening in the future, I am so happy to be in the company of people who also love talking about these topics that we've gotten so good at avoiding and socially normed to not bring up. So I feel like I'm home when I'm within community spaces where we're like, let's go there. So
Yeah.
that's what we're going to do today.
Thank you. Good.
Cool. So I'm going to share some visuals, but before I do that, I want to just invite everybody who's listening, whether it's now or in the future, to close your eyes if you can do so in a safe way or are in the mood, and to invite into the room that you're in, into the Zoom room that we're in, someone in your life who you have grieved. And it might be someone who has physically left, it might be a relationship that has ended, it might be someone who is physically present but mentally no longer present, and all of the different ways that we might experience the grief of someone. And I'd love for you to invite them into the room, and I would love for you to salute them in some way that feels right to you. And that salute might feel like a bow, it might feel like a hug, it might feel like a middle finger. Many of us have complicated relationships with those we are grieving, and that's okay too. And I would love for them to just kind of be with us over the course of the next half an hour as we talk through some of these themes. So I'm going to introduce you to my person. Can you see this big, bright yellow slide? Great. So here is my person. This is my dad, Jose. He was awesome. And yes, past tense, as Erin mentioned in my intro, this was sort of the primary loss experience that brought me into this work. I feel like many of us, most of us who are in this space have some sort of personal direct experience with grief, or we have our own story, our own person that we've just invited into the room. And life with him was really good. It was complex. There were complications. But one of the things that I always remember feeling so good with him around was the family dinner table. He loved food, he loved wine, he loved long, deep conversations. I obviously wasn't enjoying the wine when I was the small fisher person with him, but over time I grew to also enjoy the wine. And yes, I also am sorry for my loss. And yet, through the kind of portal of his departure, I have gained one of the most powerful lessons and journeys of my life. So when I'm not working on or talking about grief and loss, the work I do is really all about building community and facilitating, and I'm also a writer, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the book that I wrote. So for many of us, after someone significant dies, we know what to do for those first 40 days. We have the memorial that we can move through. There's sort of the social norm of dropping food off and the meal train, and there's generally a sense of what to do if we're lucky for those first 40 days. But it was really after that first 40 days where I got the sense that we had sort of culturally lost the plot. There's sort of this expectation that we get on with it, we are back at work, we might not be feeling comfortable talking about them in the same way. I was 21 when my dad died, and I was the first person in my peer group to experience significant loss. And it felt like I'd kind of gotten drop kicked into this world of grief and loss that none of my friends had been through yet. So it really brings up this question of like, how do you tend to your grief after the funeral is over and after those first 40 days? So I did what like any self-respecting elder millennial would do, and I Googled it. I remember going to Google and typing in like grief, what is this? What's about to happen? And I found there were two things that felt really true. There were sort of two types of images that presented themselves when I was looking at like the aesthetics of grief. One was this lady, bless her heart, the white lady at the end of the dock, probably somewhere in Maine, could be like a Nicholas Sparks novel cover. And I remember thinking that like grief was being portrayed as this sort of single note emotion of loneliness and sadness. And then I also remember seeing a lot of images depicting the amazing Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Grief, which many of us know is a body of work she developed when studying people who are dying, and it was later extrapolated to people that are grieving, but generally has created a sense that like once you check box denial, box anger, box bargaining, box suppression, box acceptance, you are done. And you would get some kind of gold star and be complete with your grief. And I soon realized that in my experience and in other people's I was talking to, there was not a linear checkbox. There would never be like a back to normal, back to factory settings. And in many ways, I felt this sort of aesthetics around grief and the kind of most common ways we talk about it left me feeling ill-equipped, or like I had a very different internal experience of what was happening than what I thought should be happening based on Google's response. So I ended up having this affinity with Goldilocks and started this sort of quest of figuring out how to tend to my grief. And I remember really thinking at the time, and I was living in Northern California, this was the year 2010, is this really all we've got? We as humans have been grieving for millennia, but I found I was having such a hard time finding the types of support or resources or conversations that scratch the itch. So in this grief Goldilocks quest, I unfortunately didn't have access to a faith community. My dad had been Catholic, had experienced abuse in the Catholic Church. We did not grow up going to church. In many ways, the faith-based communities are the places we go to tend to grief, in the way that when there's a cat in the tree, you call the fire department. Usually when somebody dies, you call the congregation that you're a part of, but there's an increasing number of people, particularly in America, that don't belong to or feel welcome within a faith-based community. So I couldn't turn there. As I mentioned, I had incredible friends who would take a bullet for me and vice versa, but none of them had experienced a significant loss yet, which meant that the closeness we felt when we were kissing boys for the first time or leaving for college for the first time and the sort of peer support we could give one another suddenly didn't apply. And they could walk with me, but they could never fully understand what I was going through. I went to some different grief groups, but oftentimes I would find myself in a young adult grief group because I was 21 and there was a teddy bear being passed around as a talking stick. And I remember being like a sexually active, tax-paying young adult, feeling like there's something about grief and googly eyes of a teddy bear that make me feel more alone than not. And there was another grief group that I got invited to that was in the basement of the hospital where my dad had received radiation. And I remember going there being like, this is the last place on earth I want to come to heal, to connect. So there's incredible people doing beautiful work in grief support, but I just couldn't find the right place to tend to where I was at the time. I found a therapist's chair to sit in, and while I love my therapist, big proponent for individual therapy, there was always a sense that the conversation would get really good around the 45-minute marker, right when the session was about to end. It was expensive, it was not covered by my insurance. And what was powerful was that over time she started to tell me that there were other people who would put their butts in that same chair at different hours of the week who are also grieving young adults, who are also longing for wanting to be in friendships with other people who got it. This again is the googly-eyed teddy bear of the support groups, the young adult support groups. And it sort of left me with this general feeling of like, what do I do? Where do I go to tend to my grief? Why is it that for this thing that humans have been experiencing for millennia, there feels like there is a dearth of creativity, of innovation, of community, of togetherness available in the modern world? And what I started to notice as I would zoom out of kind of the 21st century capitalistic American culture's take on grief is that grief culture across time, across culture, across spaces has not always been so monochromatic. It's not always been sad white lady at the end of the dock. It's not always been simply a 5-box check mark of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model. It has been gilded and winged. It's been burning a Viking ship and casting it to sea, warrior style. It's been like a cuddle puddle with your friends wearing gorgeous drapey robes. It's been literally holding hands with death, dancing around the grave, hand in hand, revelry, realness about the truth of our existence. It's been tableaus of feasts and music. It's been ripping the shirts from our chest with the intensity of it all. It's been gathering in a circle. There's been a rhythm to it and music to it. It's been epic architectural landscapes, doubling as tombs and reminders of the people that once were here. It's been bright, and it is bright and candlelit, and it's gilded, and it tastes sweet, and it's candlelit, and it's frickin' fuchsia. There are ways that we can tend to grief in community that can be fuchsia. So I went back to my own context and realized all of these ways in which I had tried to find support and hadn't had that Goldilocks itch been scratched, and realized that there was one place where I felt really good in my grief, and it was around the dinner table. And it was thinking about the part of my relationship to my dad that I missed the most, the sitting down to meals, the long conversations, the elastic back end, the opening of a bottle of wine, the passing of a plate of dessert. And what I learned in my research is that humans have been feasting the dead for millennia. It's common. It's a human instinct to come together and break bread and talk about the people who are no longer here. And it made me realize that I too could start a dinner party for people who might also want to talk about it. So what I realized was I needed a table mate. I couldn't have a dinner party of one. And here's another moment where I want to have you invite somebody into the room. So think about a time when you were going through something hard, or you felt isolated from the world, and somebody broke through that membrane, that bubble between you and the world, or they showed up or said something that made you realize, like, oh, I'm not the only person. This could be an old friend. This could be a passing comment from a person at the grocery checkout line. Curious for you to invite that person into the room with us too. This is my version of that person. This is my friend Lennon Flowers. And we were coworkers, working at this cool magazine in LA. And we were walking back from a coffee break one day, and I admitted to Lennon that I kind of let it fall out that my dad had just recently died a few months before. I'd gotten really good at hiding this fact about my life. I didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable by telling them that my dad had recently died in the way that so many of us grievers learn how to contort ourselves to ensure other people don't have to reckon with the reality of existence. And what was so surprising this day when I let it fall out that my dad had recently died, Lennon's reaction was not, "I'm sorry for your loss, change the subject," or the deer in the headlights look that so many of us often get when the other person just like has no idea what to say. But what Lennon responded to me by saying was, "Me too." She had had a mom recently die of cancer, and we agreed before we got back to the office, the open floor plan office where we definitely couldn't talk about this in the open, that we would get together and we would have dinner and we would allow the story of our grief to become the main course of the meal, so to speak. This is an email that I wrote to Lennon and forwarded to a few other people who I knew who I'd been tracking had experienced a significant loss, inviting them over for a meal to break bread and to share the stories of the people who both were once here and the stories of what it was like living in the world without them. This was back in 2010, as you can see. And I wrote to them about the loneliness that I was feeling as I was kind of making my way through this carnival funhouse of healing and grieving and bereavement, and that there was one crucial room I couldn't find. And it was simply a room with friends, a room of people who got it. So we gathered with four other people, and we realized that the thing we'd all gotten very good at avoiding could finally come spilling out. And we talked not just about the cancer or the diagnosis or the death, but we talked about dating with grief as a part of our story. We talked about navigating relationships to the living, including living family members. We talked about what we were doing without this person in our life who maybe had been our confidant or our caretaker or our cheerleader, and how we were filling that space as best we could. And what was powerful was that we were not the only six people who wanted to sit down and have this kind of conversation. And over the last 15 years, the Dinner Party, as the organization is now known, that Lennon was the executive director of for many years, has grown from that first table of six in Los Angeles to a community of tens of thousands of people who have signed up and gathered in person around an actual dinner party table, sharing a meal, potluck style, oftentimes with recipes that remind them or tell the story of their person, or virtually. We also have a buddy system for folks that are like, I don't want to coordinate with a group of 12, but can you help me find one person who I can text with and call with, which is another offering that we have. So as word started to spread, we started to realize that there was such power in shifting from thinking about peer support as a sort of nice to have into actually a core part of what someone's grief care plan looked like. The work really became, at this point, what does it look like for a dinner party table to meet when Lennon or myself or those original dinner parties aren't in the room? Frankly, we'll probably never meet them. We'll never speak to them on the phone. This one cake I love on the upper right was for the anniversary of a table that had been meeting for a year. So where we're at as an organization is that we have seen or matched or invited to the table over 20,000 partiers, as we fondly call our people. In New York City alone, I favor this stat because I live near New York City, but over 150 tables have launched since 2019. 97% would recommend the dinner party to a friend, and 81% already have. I love this quote: "Before the dinner party, I was always the outlier. Now I found a place I belong, and I can't imagine my life without my tribe." It has been powerful to see our work get validated by traditional media. And what we've found is that it's really the normalization that's powerful. It's the finding of companions that's powerful. In fact, you can go online right now and scroll through, sign up and scroll through, and there are live tables across the country that you could sign up today. Our age range is 18 to 45. We've really sort of focused on this. Not kids and applicable for kids' bereavement support, and maybe not at the same age that folks that are filling more traditional grief support centers. So around these tables, I started to hear stories, dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that looked so different than this sort of stock imagery definition of grief. I heard these stories that were wildly vivid, that were creative, that were full of life. And I don't mean to troll whoever this person is that is sitting on this dock, but to me, there's such important work to do to expand like the aesthetic definition of what grief can look like. And I started to find that these folks that were tending to their grief in different or unexpected or unique or creative ways were doing what I started to talk about as renegade grief, meaning they were defying the status quo that would have us deny or hide or forget or pretend like we weren't grieving, but instead are going to be a little bit of an outlaw, are going to swim against the cultural currents and tend to their grief in their own way. So I started hearing stories like Maggie, who every year on the anniversary of her dad's death would break out the pasta maker that her and her dad used to use. And she would make a huge batch of pasta and invite a bunch of friends over. And you would never know walking into the room that it was an evening honoring somebody's death because it was warm and connecting and so alive. And she still does this every single year. There was Misty, who came to one of the original dinners, who heard about this incredible folk artist named Grandma Prisbury, who made buildings out of glass bottles. Her mom had died in a car accident, and her dad, who survived the accident, started drinking excessively as a way of managing his grief. And what Misty did was take the leftover bottles from his drinking habit and created a sanctuary for herself in her family's backyard. Building, this is one of Prisby's homes, but Misty built basically a structure, a studio, a sanctuary for herself so she could have some privacy and alone time as she struggled with living at home with her dad. There was Saul, who took this incredible archival footage from his dad. He had recorded direct-to-camera interviews with himself as he was dying of cancer, and many years after his dad's death, Saul made a film called The Death of My Two Fathers that made sense of and explored his relationship to these videos that his dad had left behind. There's Janelle, who started postal service for the dead. Janelle was always really curious about this longing she had to write a letter to her person who is no longer physically here, and wondered, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a P.O. box somewhere in the world where you could send letters to your people? And she started it. And you can Google Postal Service for the Dead and send a letter in today. There's a family of a young boy named Magnus who died in a bicycling accident, and they've been doing incredible activism using Magnus's loss as jet fuel for rider justice around the world. This is one of so many examples of people using their story of grief as ignition to change policy, to make sure that no other people die in an unjust way. For my family, we turned to Dungeons and Dragons to tend to our grief, and I'd never heard those two phrases in the same sentence before, Dungeons and Dragons and grief, but my younger sibling is really into D&D and invited us to play with them. My brother and I joined, and we had this incredible healing experience all together in through like the escapism of a fantasy world. And it was written about in The Guardian just back in March. So I always ask, like, okay, why is this so renegade? Why, if grieving is just innate to the human spirit, why is this thing that's so instinctual to us a radical act? Like, how did we get here? And for me, there's sort of three moments. Excuse my segue for a little historical moment, but there's sort of three moments that I look at over the course of the last 100+ years to explain when did we have to go renegade to tend to our grief. And I'd be so curious to hear from this community, what are the other years or moments or milestones you would add to this? So one is our guy Freud, who wrote this paper, Mourning and Melancholia, that basically set the cultural best practice for how we respond to grief in the 20th century. And his take was the thing to do, the right thing to do, the well thing to do is to break bonds with the dead. And that if we are lingering, if we are overly attached, if we are continuing to relate to them and talk to them, there's something wrong with us. And he really introduced like the pathologization of grief. But what was powerful is that, yes, he wrote this paper, he kind of set this domino in culture. But what later happened was his daughter died, his beloved daughter, his favorite daughter, which he always refers to her as, which I think is like hysterical and bizarre. I thought we weren't supposed to have favorite children. And after he experienced loss himself, he wrote a letter to a friend that basically refutes the psychological theory that had already spread around the world. And he says that no matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. So I look at this moment as a person who maybe hadn't had his own grief experience, establishing a psychological norm that has encouraged us all to break bonds, later realized, oh shit, it's actually quite different than I thought it was. But the damage had already been done. And I think for many of us, what's happening now is we're trying to unlearn or get out of our cultural muscle memory Freud's breaking bonds model. And then there's this Elizabeth Kubler-Ross moment. I'm a huge fan of hers. I love this woman. And when she introduced these 5 stages of grief that we were talking about earlier, the Western mind is so hungry for a simple box to check that her work, I think, in many ways was sort of oversimplified and distorted. I think she's rolling over in her grave to think that there are people that, when they think of science related to grief, pull up her research and assume that there's sort of a 5th box that they might check and be complete with their grief. She was very clear that is not how she related to the research at all. Quote from her here, the reality is that you will grieve forever, you will not get over, you will learn to live with it. But in many ways, the meme, it is a meme, had stuck. And then this third moment is in 2000, and this might seem a little unrelated because Robert Putnam is not a grief expert, but he is a social scientist, and he wrote this very important book called Bowling Alone, where he talked about the fact that our social fabric is unraveling, that we no longer have places where we are in relationship with people outside of our nuclear families or our work. And that's causing really significant issues for how we relate to one another, how we resource one another. His quote is that our growing social capital deficit threatens educational performance, safe neighborhoods, equitable tax collection, democratic responsiveness, everyday honesty, and even our health and happiness. And I would add to that, it's negatively impacting our ability to grieve collectively because we have fewer and fewer places where we can go to be held from people outside of our immediate family who are grieving too. And he's kind of a prophet because 25 years later, the Surgeon General, the person whose job it is to tell us, like, don't smoke cigarettes, they're bad for you, is now telling us, forget about cigarettes. Well, don't do those too, but the real problem that we're facing now, like the existential health crisis of our generation, is actually this crisis of loneliness. And he even says in this quote that smoking cigarettes, like, this loneliness we're feeling has a bigger impact on our mortality than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or having 6 alcoholic drinks a day. Pick your poison. But what's powerful about Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General's work, is that he recognizes that there's a solution for this cultural sickness of isolation. And actually, we can be the medicine that one another needs. That, like, we can be the solution that people crave. It's about creating spaces where people can come together, can be honest, can show up for one another. The question becomes, as he says, do we have the courage to speak up and stand up for others, to reach out to them when we feel they may be in need? And when are we in need more than when we are grieving, than when we are anticipating the departure of someone that we're caretaking for? So all of this work lands me in this place of just wanting to scream from the mountaintops, grief is not a problem. It's not something we're going to fix or solve or save anyone from. The problem is the social isolation. and the cultural norms that get in the way of tending to grief in community. Like that is the crisis that we need to solve for. And so my hypothesis is, what if each of us could go a little renegade by turning the source of our deepest isolation, the grief that we feel, the loneliness around that grief that we feel, and transmuting it into spaces that are marked by healing, by connection, and community support. And what's powerful to me is that we are grieving so many more things than just the people who are physically leaving. Pandemic amnesia is a real thing, where so many of our movements and moments of civil unrest are rooted in a moment of grief. I'm a former Angelina, and the dinner party started in LA, and we watched our city burn earlier this year, and then the rest of the world kind of carried on. You might even say that the crisis of democracy we're facing right now is something else very much worth grieving. There's this amazing biblical scholar named Walter Brueggemann. He wrote about these 3 urgent prophetic tasks to face the era that we're living in. He said that one is facing reality and one is finding hope, but that you can't get to the hope or address the issues that we're facing until you've done the middle step, which is tend to the grief. And if we're actually going to like make a dent in any of these meta crises that we're facing, we have to be able to be in relationship to the grief that is at the core of all of them. So I get obsessed thinking about what would happen if we could reframe grief from this sort of niche mental health issue that we regard as psychologically unhealthy, something to get over as quickly as you can, something to deal with on your own or with your therapist exclusively, to instead actually like a radical act and a critical life skill. If you want to survive in the 21st century, like you need to know how to identify and move through your own grief. And I really think it's the muscle that will make or break whether we can meet this moment. And as Walter Brueggemann would say, it is the portal to get to the hope and get to the resolution. So if I could travel back in time and give this person, little me, a message, I would tell her that yes, life can be brutal. Yes, the culture we live in is often cut off from its ability to tend to hard emotions, but that human beings have hardwired in our spirits, in our brains, a real knowledge, a real wisdom that knows how to grieve. And I would tell her 3 quick takeaways. You're going to need to find your crew. Grief has always been a collective act. You need to find your people. 2, there are things you can do, rituals you can design, care practices you can turn to, whether it's once or once a week, that will help you move through your grief experiences. And the 3rd thing I would tell her is it's time for us all to champion a grief renaissance, to be the person we wish had called us when we were experiencing a significant loss, to be a part of rewiring these cultural neural pathways that would have us forget or deny or break our bonds. And I would tell her that yes, some things would be heartbreaking endings, but inevitably, if she was lucky, many times those things would also become some of the most beautiful beginnings. And I would also tell her that she should buy this book in about 15 years and learn more about all of the above. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Carla. Thank you for taking your grief and your loneliness and creating what you needed right out of it. Like that's what you did. Yeah, and that's what I relate to so many things you said. I'm just like cheering you on the whole time, but I have the exact same origin story. And I think so many people who are now like creating progress and opening up space and giving language here in this space do. And that is that we have had to create a grief culture where one really didn't exist even 20 years ago, right? And so we found ourselves in these really lonely places. I loved the way that you went through, like first I went to the faith-based situation and, that wasn't really meaningful. Same, right? Then I went to the therapist and 45 minutes in, we were maybe starting to get somewhere, but then I'll see you next week and I have to survive a whole week. Like it's just such unsaturating support. And what we need is each other. And what we need is to be like daring enough to have these conversations and for them to be met with love and also with resonance, right? Like the other grievers, because it's another type of grief fatigue or of loneliness to be seeking comfort and support from people who just really can't give it because they haven't been there yet and they don't, they don't have that part of them yet. So thank you for creating this out of that. I very much relate to like all of my death work. In hindsight, it's been such a journey, but in hindsight, I'm like, I built this thing because it's what I needed the first time I was in deep grief and it didn't exist. And you did the same. And when enough of us do it, we get to create a culture shift. And it's starting to happen. And I've been working more recently with birth doulas who want to come into the death space and realizing that like the birth doulas made this same claim back in the 70s. Like we're going to reclaim birth and we're going to do it at home. And, we're doing that now in the death space and in the grief space. And it shouldn't be taboo, neither should birth. We're really putting ourselves at a disadvantage by being too afraid to have the conversations that will like ultimately set us free. So I guess I'm just saying yes, and thank you for being a voice who gets that and who shares that. Yeah, and congratulations on your book as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I feel like when you feel a cultural calling that something should exist, but it doesn't, chances are other people feel that too. And there's something so powerful about being like, what if I just make a V1, a draft of this idea and invite other people into it and see what happens. So congratulations on the work that you're building. And thank you for being a part of the movement.
Of course. And we're both speaking to the same thing, right? Looking back in history and also looking across cultures and what other people have practices and, what their wisdom is. Like what it always brings me back to, especially when you were talking about the timeline, most of those things I didn't know. So thank you for teaching me. I think of it more in terms of like the Industrial Revolution. We kind of outsourced all of the care at the same time, right? Like the end of life care for our elders and death care. And as soon as someone died, they were whisked away and sometimes they were never seen again at all. But if they were, it's at a viewing. And in modern times, we take all of these interventions to kind of avoid and deny death, like, embalming and a lot. I could go on and on. So I appreciated that you said like that the first 40 days felt structured, but then it went off the wires because I don't feel like the first 40 days are very well structured, really.
Kind of generous.
Yeah, I think that was generous of you. I think we have a big missed opportunity in that space because one of the things that I ask in a lot of my classes at the top is like, who's been to a bad funeral? And almost everybody raises their hands, right? Because I'm generalizing, but like most funerals are quite generic. Same thing, copy and paste for most people. Yeah. Or, they're misrepresented by a faith system. Like we came and had a pastor come in who didn't know them and was trying to save people, or their identity's misrepresented, their name is mispronounced, like a great many of things can go wrong in the funeral services. And that's because, again, it's like become industrialized and so many of our funeral homes are corporate. And really the truth of the matter is we need secular celebrants. We need people to be able to, like, I get so many people who reach out to me to do funerals and they start with this apology almost that it breaks my heart every time, right? When they tell me that like so-and-so, like the person who died, who we're going to create services for, wasn't necessarily religious. And they say it in this way of like, can I still get good services? Like, can we still honor them right? Because they didn't have the right person to go to. And most funeral homes, they don't have clergy on staff or celebrants on staff. So we tell our doulas, if you're interested in celebrant work and become a celebrant, go network with funeral homes and offer those services. But the greater point that I'm trying to make is like, we could do so much better to create rituals for grief and protocols for grief and community support when the death is happening, because that's when the grief is fluid. So we really need people to show up in that space as well. And then, yes, like you identified it so perfectly, when all of the choices are done being made and their body is in the ground, like then it's that radio silence. And that's when people start to question, like, how is the world still going on and I'm still here, right? And we really need each other. So I think the silver lining of grief is exactly what you said as well. Like it teaches us that we need each other. And we live in this hyper individualistic culture that forgets that to our own detriment in so many different categories. when we're grieving, we need each other. And so those of us who get it have to show up when other people are grieving and show them, okay, look, it's this easy. You don't even have to know what to say, right? Like so many people avoid it because they don't know what to say. Well, you can't really say anything. You can't fix it, right? So first get over yourself. Like you can't fix it, but just show up and say, I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm here.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thanks for making such a beautiful community oriented, way of doing that. Um, how did it kind of take off from we're going to do, this locally for anybody who wants to come to this nationwide thing? What was the progress of that like?
It was a lot of hard work and
Mhm.
also keeping up with the demand that we were receiving. It was interesting. I worked in marketing at the time for my day job, and Len, my co-founder, worked like was building the dinner party full time. I had a day job in marketing, and my work was so much about like how do we get people to care about this issue or buy this product? How do we manufacture desire? That was my
Yeah.
market.
Hmm.
But with the dinner party, we've only ever had more demand than we've had supply of seats.
Yeah.
Like this sort of just struck a nerve in culture. Um, to your point about like oftentimes the thing that we're craving, other people are craving too. It's just like we were the ones to set up the system and lay some
Structuring
tracks
it.
to come
Yeah.
in. So for many years, it was like the work of being fiscally sponsored as a 501(c)(3), needing to fundraise, to have a small staff, to start to figure out how is this thing going to work. It was like understanding what were the ingredients that would turn into a strong dinner group, which was like a lot of scraping our knees along the way until we kind of figured out the model that was sticky for folks. And then it was sort of figuring out like how do we find hosts and train them and how does the structure work and what's the back end look like, and more and more it became less a project about grief, but really a project about community organizing and how do we put up a bat signal and get the right people in the same room and see what conditions we can help set such that a year later they're still meeting. So, yeah, I really salute Lennon, my co-founder, and the staff that we've had over the years that kind of did the hard work of figuring all that out. And we're still evolving it and building it and refining it and actively fundraising. If you or anyone wants to become a contributing supporter to the dinner party, we're always looking for folks to help open up seats and around the community.
Really cool.
But yeah, it's a beautiful thing that I hope is around for as long as I'm around or as long as it's needed.
It is
And
a
something tells
beautiful
me
thing.
it's going to be needed for a little while longer here.
Oh yeah, the collective grief is a whole other thing. I taught a class a few days ago where we're kind of asking ourselves to inventory our grief in terms of like what is the personal grief from my individual loss, that I have accrued over my lifetime? What is the inherited grief that I just came in with because my ancestors didn't have the privilege to heal it because they were too busy pulling themselves up by the bootstraps? And then like what is this cultural grief that is so overwhelming, this collective grief that is so overwhelming? And then as you said, like not to be the white lady at the end of the bridge. Like, how can I actually exercise this? How can I do something with this that's productive, that's community oriented? Because that is what actually makes us feel better too. Like, that's what works.
I like finding meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, we're meaning makers. We're meaning makers. Making meaning of things somehow helps us to heal. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I think it's excellent. Carol, hi, I just saw your chat. Would you like to unmute yourself and say anything or ask any questions? Nice to see you today.
I thought this was fabulous. It's definitely has me thinking um, just more about it. Just I haven't thought about grief outside of just kind of the traditional, and so I really love that perspective and being able to, just be creative with our grief and be able to be inclusive while being creative with our grief. And so I really appreciate these insights. So I'm going to buy the book.
I'm gonna buy the book too.
Supporting the arts, much appreciated.
I think another thing that kind of fits into this conversation, I loved how you said first you have to grieve before you can have hope, right?
Mm,
And I love that because it's a continuum of something I've always said, which is before we can grieve, we have to survive. Like
Mm,
first we have to, there's some meme that's gone around the internet forever. I wish I knew who to credit it to, but it says, I will write poetry about this, but first I have to survive it, right?
mm,
Like in
beautiful.
order to really get to a place like, I think about what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. Yes, of course, those people are gutted with grief, but they don't have the privilege of grief, which sounds like an oxymoron, but they don't have the privilege of grief to practice it, right? They can't practice their rituals and their rites and their mourning traditions, etc. And so, in reflecting on that, I've kind of made this pivot in my understanding of grief. I don't want to offend anyone when I say that to grieve well is a privilege, because I know how contradictory that feels. And there was a time in my own depth of grief that I would have been offended by a statement like that. But it does. It requires that we've survived. It requires really what to do it well, to grieve well. It requires unproductive time, which is hard to come by in our culture. And it requires community support, people who can love you and support you through it. And so maybe to grieve in itself is not a privilege, although in a way it is because it indicates love. But to grieve well, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to do it. And I think that we need to hook into that a little bit more. I think that
Yeah,
helps it be something more proactive and less victimization, stagnancy.
yeah, yeah, that's powerful. I think about the like lack of federally mandated bereavement leave and like honest, like truly who has the privilege of being able to take time off, unpaid time off,
Fair, right?
not just
No,
like
you
deal
get a
with it.
couple days and then you got to figure it out. It's terrible.
So yeah, it's an important point.
Yeah. Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Carol, for being here. Carol, where are you calling in from?
Lawrence, Kansas.
Very nice.
How's Kansas doing today, Carol?
It's all right. I just moved from Salina to Lawrence at the last month, and so I like Lawrence because it's a bit more progressive and open and diverse, and I'm hoping that I can offer services, end of life services for people for everyone. Not, I mean, obviously, just for people of color, for people of gender, preference, for all of that, and that is greatly. It's way more accepted here in Lawrence than it is
Good.
in the majority of Kansas. So
I have only heard good things about Lawrence,
yeah,
and we've definitely had a handful of doulas come through training. I feel like there's like a little scene emerging there. Is
yeah,
that true?
yes, definitely, yeah.
Cool.
And there's a collective here that I hope to join of death doulas in the area, the Kansas City, Lawrence, Topeka area. And so, yeah, so it'll be good.
I love to see where the little hubs are popping up. We need them in every city.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's becoming the thing too, Carla. You talked about like how there was more demand than there was supply. When Lauren and I started Death Wives, we kind of felt the same way. Like it was surprisingly easy to fill the classes. We did not have to convince people. We just had to put it out there. And it shouldn't be surprising. I mean, what that speaks to is that like under our cultural death aversion, there is a deeper layer of recognizing the need to have
Mhm.
it. And so people would flock to it. But I will say for both of us and for many other, death educators that we know, like the demand, I don't want to say this wrong or, overgeneralize it, but the demand seems to be simmering down on an individual, like educator basis, but it's because there are so many of us now. It's because we have actually built this culture and there are more places for people to go to find the community and to get the education. And so while that takes us a little bit out of that like blue ocean of business opportunity, it is changing the culture in a meaningful way. And that's what we want more than anything else. So go
We
team.
want that to be the norm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me at the
Absolutely.
Tea Talk.
Thank you for coming to the Tea Talk. Wishing you guys both a beautiful afternoon. And thanks again.
You
Sounds
as well.
great.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.